Lina Carter clutched the straps of her small backpack as she stepped into the grand lobby of Reynolds Corporation. The towering marble columns and sleek, modern furniture made her feel impossibly small. At just 10 years old, she barely reached the reception desk, her worn sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floor. Though her clothes were clean, the faded fabric and careful patches on her jeans told a quiet story of struggle and careful preservation. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage her mother had instilled in her. She had come too far to turn back now. The receptionist, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a nameplate reading Margaret Holloway, arched an eyebrow as she glanced at the young girl standing before her. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice polite but skeptical. Lina lifted her chin, determination settling in her wide brown eyes. "I need to see Mr. Reynolds, please. It's important." Margaret's smile remained professional but indulgent. "Mr. Reynolds is a very busy man. Perhaps your parents could call and schedule an appointment." Lina hesitated for only a moment before pushing forward. "My mom," her voice caught, but she pressed on. "She passed away last week. Before she died, she told me to find him. She said to tell him that she had the same tattoo as he does." For the first time, Margaret's expression softened. She studied Lina carefully, as if sensing something beyond the child's grief, something real, something important. Finally, after a moment's hesitation, she picked up the phone. "Wait right here," she instructed. Lina perched on the edge of a leather chair in the vast lobby, swinging her feet anxiously as she waited. 20 minutes felt like hours. Then, the elevator doors across the room slid open with a quiet chime. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped out. Alexander Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Corporation, was every bit as commanding as the magazines and television interviews had made him out to be. He carried himself with quiet authority, his dark brown hair neatly combed back, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with precision. He looked more like a man who solved high-stakes business deals than someone who should be meeting a 10-year-old girl. But when his gaze fell on Lina, something flickered in his expression, something fleeting, gone so fast she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his deep voice calm yet firm. Lina nodded, gripping the small photograph in her pocket like a lifeline. She took a slow, steady breath and pointed toward his wrist, where a hint of ink peeked out from beneath his crisp white shirt cuff. "My mom had a tattoo like yours," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She told me to find the man with the matching one." Silence stretched between them. Alexander's expression remained unreadable, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the desk. "What was your mother's name?" he asked. Lina's heart pounded. "Sophia Carter." His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. "And where is your father?" Lina swallowed hard. "I never had one," she admitted quietly. "It was always just me and Mom." A long pause. Then, Alexander pressed a button on his intercom. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," he instructed. Turning back to Lina, his voice softened just a fraction. "I think we need to talk. But not here. Would you like some lunch?" Lina hesitated, unsure if this was a step towards something better or something worse. But she had nothing left to lose. She nodded. "Okay." Lina sat in a quiet corner of Monroe's Bistro, a high-end restaurant with soft lighting and polished wooden tables. The air smelled of fresh-baked bread and roasted garlic, but her stomach was too knotted with nerves to think about food. Across from her, Alexander Reynolds, the man her mother had told her to find, stirred his black coffee, his piercing blue eyes scanning the photograph Lina had handed him. The picture was old, slightly curled at the edges. It showed a younger Alexander, laughing, his arm draped around a beautiful woman with dark, expressive eyes, Sophia Carter. He hadn't said much since they arrived. Now, he set the photograph down carefully on the table, exhaling slowly. "We met in college," he said, his voice quieter than before. She was studying environmental science. Smart, passionate, always challenging me on everything. A small, almost wistful smile flickered across his face. "We thought we could change the world together." Lina nodded, recognizing the way her mother had spoken about those years, the way her eyes used to shine when she talked about the past. "She told me that, too," she said softly. Alexander hesitated before rolling up his sleeve. The tattoo, the same intricate Celtic knot her mother had worn on her wrist, was there, inked into his skin like a memory he couldn't erase. "We got these together," he admitted. It was supposed to mean something permanent, an eternal bond. Lina bit her lip. "Then why did you leave her?" His head snapped up, surprise flashing across his face. "I didn't leave her," he said, his voice firm. Then he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lina, when my father died suddenly, I had no choice. I had to take over Reynolds Corporation. Overnight, I went from a college kid dreaming of adventure to the CEO of a billion-dollar company." "My mom said she didn't fit into that world," Lina murmured. "She said you had important things to do." Alexander flinched. "She said that?" Lina nodded. He was silent for a long moment, staring out the window as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had been missing for too long. "I looked for her," he finally admitted. 3 years after we separated. I wasn't ready before that. I was drowning in expectations, trying to live up to a legacy I never asked for. But when I finally went back to find her, she was gone. Changed her number, moved away. No one knew where she was. Lina's fingers curled around the edge of her napkin. "She never told me that." Alexander's jaw tightened. "If I had known about you," he shook his head, looking directly at her, "I would have never stopped looking." Lina swallowed hard. A part of her had always wondered, deep down, if there was more to the story. If maybe her father wasn't the careless man she had imagined, but someone who had simply lost his way. "She didn't hate you," she said after a moment. "She just didn't want to hold you back." A bitter chuckle escaped Alexander's lips. "She never let me decide that for myself." Lina didn't know what to say. The weight of years of misunderstanding sat heavy between them. After a long pause, Alexander leaned forward. "Where are you staying now?" "With Mrs. Lanning, our neighbor," Lina answered. "She's nice, but she's old and has grandkids visiting soon. A social worker is coming tomorrow to take me somewhere else." Alexander's face darkened slightly. "A foster home?" Lina shrugged. "I guess." Silence stretched between them again. Then, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He spoke briefly, his words short and direct. When he hung up, he looked back at her. "I spoke to your social worker," he said. "She's agreed to let you stay with me. At least for now." Lina's breath caught. "You want me to live with you?" A flicker of something unfamiliar, maybe vulnerability, crossed his face. "I don't know the first thing about being a father, Lina. But if you'll let me, I'd like the chance to try." For the first time that day, Lina felt something warm push through the fear and uncertainty, a tiny spark of hope. "Okay," she whispered. Alexander exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. "All right," he said softly. "Let's go home." Lina Carter sat quietly in the back seat of Alexander Reynolds' sleek black sedan, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack as they drove through the glittering streets of downtown New York. The car smelled of leather and something faintly citrusy, a scent so different from the familiar warmth of her old apartment. She kept glancing at Alexander, trying to understand the man her mother had once loved, the man who was now taking her home. His grip on the steering wheel was firm, but there was a slight tension in his shoulders, like he was carrying the weight of something far heavier than the car they were riding in. Every now and then, he'd glance at her in the rearview mirror, as if making sure she was still there. "You don't have to be scared," he finally said, his voice quieter than she expected. "I'm not scared," Lina replied, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Alexander sighed, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I know this is a lot. It's a lot for me, too," he admitted. "But I want to do this right. For you." Lina didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded. A few minutes later, they pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a towering glass high-rise. Lina's eyes widened as she stepped out of the car. The building was nothing like the cozy apartment she had shared with her mother. Everything about it felt too big, too polished, like the kind of place where important people lived, people who never worried about bills or broken heaters. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of classical music playing overhead. When the doors opened, Lina stepped into an apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the New York skyline, and the furniture was sleek and modern, all in shades of white and gray. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances that looked like they had never been used. "You live here?" she asked, her voice small. Alexander set his keys on the marble counter. "I do. But it's just a place, Lina. It doesn't have to stay this way. If you want to change things, make it feel more like home, we can do that." She nodded absently, wandering toward the large living room. A single framed photo sat on a shelf, a formal portrait of Alexander at some corporate event, standing stiffly beside a group of executives. There were no family pictures, no signs of life beyond work. "Do you ever get lonely here?" she asked suddenly. Alexander hesitated, then exhaled. "I guess I never thought about it before." Lina glanced at him. "Mom used to say that people who work too much forget how to live." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She always had a way with words. Just then, a door opened down the hall, and a woman in her 60s, dressed in a crisp white blouse and gray slacks, stepped out. She had short silver hair and a kind but professional expression. "Lina, this is Mrs. Sullivan," Alexander introduced. "She's been with me for a long time. She'll help you with anything you need." Mrs. Sullivan smiled warmly. "It's nice to meet you, dear. Are you hungry? I can make something before you get settled in." Lina shook her head. "No, thank you." Alexander cleared his throat. "Come on, I'll show you your room." He led her down a long hallway and opened a door to a spacious bedroom. The bed was large, covered in a pristine white comforter, and there was a full-length window that overlooked the city. Lina stood in the center of the room, feeling impossibly small. "It's big," she murmured. Alexander shifted uncomfortably. "If you don't like it, we can change things." Lina hesitated before turning to face him. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because I should have been there a long time ago. And because you deserve better than foster care." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know how to be your daughter." His face softened. "I don't know how to be your dad either. But we can figure it out. Together." For the first time since stepping into his world, Lina felt a small flicker of something, maybe not quite trust, but the beginning of it. She set her backpack down by the bed. "Okay." Alexander exhaled, nodding. "Okay." Alexander Reynolds sat at the head of the long, polished conference table in the boardroom of Reynolds Corporation, the weight of a dozen scrutinizing gazes pressing down on him. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly, but inside, the air was thick with tension. The board members, older men in tailored suits, some of whom had known his father, were not pleased. Neither was Harold Whitmore, the company's largest shareholder and a longtime family ally, who sat across from him with his hands folded neatly on the table. "Alexander," Harold began, his voice calm but edged with authority, "we need to talk about your recent distractions." Alexander leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Go on." Harold exchanged glances with several board members before continuing. "You've canceled critical meetings, rescheduled negotiations, and most concerning of all, you've abruptly withdrawn from discussions regarding the Whitmore-Reynolds merger, a deal that's been years in the making." He steepled his fingers. "And then, out of nowhere, you take in a child." Murmurs rippled across the table. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Her name is Lina Carter. And she's my daughter." Harold sighed, shaking his head. "A daughter you didn't know existed until 2 weeks ago." "Alexander, we sympathize, truly, but this company cannot afford instability. Investors are already asking questions, and the press." "The press?" Alexander interrupted, his voice colder now. "Is that what this is about? Optics?" Harold didn't flinch. "Optics matter. And so do priorities." He leaned forward. "Reynolds Corporation has always been your priority. You built this company into what it is today. You made it stronger than it ever was under your father. But now, you're making decisions based on emotion, not strategy." Alexander's fingers tapped against the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Tell me, Harold," he said evenly, "is it emotion or strategy to recognize when a company needs to change?" A few board members shifted uncomfortably. "Change?" Harold echoed. "Yes," Alexander said, his gaze sweeping across the table. "For years, this company has operated under outdated policies. We've prioritized profits over sustainability, short-term gains over long-term responsibility. And do you know who called us out on it?" He leaned forward. "Lina's mother." Silence fell over the room. "Sophia Carter," Alexander continued, his voice measured. 8 years ago, her environmental advocacy group exposed serious failings in our manufacturing division. We ignored it. I ignored it." He exhaled sharply. "I won't make that mistake again." Harold's expression darkened. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that effective immediately, Reynolds Corporation will be launching a corporate environmental responsibility initiative, one that actually holds weight." Alexander's eyes locked onto Harold's. "And I will personally oversee it." The room erupted in protests, but Alexander remained calm. For the first time in years, he wasn't just following a boardroom script, he was making a choice that mattered. And he wasn't going to back down. The boardroom had been silent for nearly a full minute. Alexander Reynolds let the weight of his words settle over the men and women seated around the long mahogany table. Across from him, Harold Whitmore's expression was unreadable, though his sharp eyes betrayed his frustration. Finally, Harold exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You're serious about this?" "I am," Alexander said without hesitation. Reynolds Corporation has operated the same way for decades, maximizing profit, minimizing accountability. But times have changed, and so must we. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Harold, however, wasn't swayed. "You're risking everything, Alexander. Your leadership, your legacy. A company like this doesn't pivot overnight." Alexander sat forward. "I'm not asking for overnight. I'm asking for commitment. A real plan." He turned toward Grace Ellison, the company's legal counsel, who had remained silent until now. "Grace, can you summarize the proposal?" Grace nodded, flipping open a thick folder. "The Reynolds Environmental Initiative will dedicate a portion of our annual budget to sustainable manufacturing, water conservation efforts, and responsible supply chain sourcing. Additionally, we will allocate resources to clean up past environmental damage caused by some of our earlier projects, starting with the Merritt River plant in Pennsylvania." A murmur ran through the boardroom. The Merritt River plant had been the center of controversy years ago, accused of polluting local water supplies. No one had ever officially taken responsibility, though Sophia Carter's reports had exposed the damage. "This will cost us millions," one of the older board members said, adjusting his glasses. "It will," Alexander agreed. "But in the long run, it will save us billions. Consumer trust, investor confidence, and regulatory compliance all depend on forward-thinking leadership." Harold shook his head. "You sound like one of those activists." Alexander didn't flinch. "Maybe I should have listened to one of them a long time ago." Harold leaned back, studying him. "And if the board votes against this?" Alexander met his gaze evenly. "Then I'll take it to the shareholders." Silence. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Alexander wasn't bluffing, he was prepared to take this fight to the investors, to the media if necessary. He wasn't just making a business decision, he was reclaiming control over the company's direction. Finally, Harold sighed, rubbing his temples. "You really are your father's son," he muttered. Then, after a long pause, he added, "Fine. Let's draft the specifics." A few hours later, as Alexander walked out of the conference room, he felt a shift, not just in the company, but in himself. Back at the penthouse, Lina was waiting, curled up on the couch, flipping through one of her mother's old journals. She looked up as he entered. "How'd it go?" He sat down beside her, rubbing his forehead. "Better than expected." "Did they listen?" she asked. "They will." He exhaled, glancing at the journal in her hands. "Your mom, she saw this coming long before I did." Lina hesitated. "She wanted you to see it, too." Alexander looked at her, really looked at her. Not just as a child he was responsible for, but as a part of the future he was now fighting for. "I do now," he said. "And I won't forget it." The smell of fresh brewed coffee filled the air as Alexander Reynolds sat across from Olivia Dawson, his fingers loosely wrapped around a ceramic mug. The cafe was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, structured world of corporate boardrooms he was used to. It had been 3 months since Lina had walked into his life and changed everything. Since then, he had made some of the most significant decisions of his career, establishing the Reynolds Environmental Initiative, restructuring the company's priorities, and most importantly, learning how to be a father. But tonight, as he sat here with Olivia, he realized something else had been shifting in his life, something he hadn't expected. Olivia smiled at him, her hazel eyes bright with curiosity. "You seem different tonight." Alexander smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Different how?" She tilted her head slightly. less like the CEO of Reynolds Corporation and more like a man who actually enjoys a good cup of coffee. He chuckled, setting his mug down. I guess I'm starting to learn there's more to life than stock reports and quarterly earnings. She raised an eyebrow. And what brought about this grand revelation? Alexander hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the window where the city lights shimmered against the glass. Lina. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Taking her in, it's forced me to see things differently. My choices, my priorities, what I want my life to actually mean. Olivia studied him for a moment before nodding. She's lucky to have you. Alexander met her eyes. I think I'm the lucky one. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Olivia had been there since the beginning, first as an advisor when he started working on the environmental initiative, then as a friend. She challenged him, debated him, made him question the things he once accepted as absolute. She was intelligent, passionate, and completely unafraid to call him out when necessary. And somewhere along the way, he had started looking forward to seeing her. So, Olivia said, setting her cup down, what's next for you and Lina? Alexander sighed. I'm trying to give her a sense of stability. Something real. She's been through enough uncertainty. Olivia nodded, but there was something unreadable in her expression. And what about you? He frowned slightly. What about me? She leaned in slightly, her voice softer. You've been so focused on making things right for everyone else. But what do you want, Alexander? The question lingered in the air between them. For years, his life had been dictated by obligations, his company, his father's expectations, the legacy he was supposed to uphold. Even after meeting Lina, his focus had been on fixing the past, on making sure she had the life she deserved. But what did he want? Alexander held Olivia's gaze, feeling something shift inside him. He wanted this. The warmth of conversation that wasn't about business. The quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken. The possibility of something more. I think, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, for the first time in a long time. I want to figure that out. A small, knowing smile touched Olivia's lips. Good, she said, reaching for her coffee again. Because I think you've spent too many years living for everyone else. He chuckled. And what do you suggest? She leaned back in her chair. Start with dinner. A real one. No corporate meetings, no environmental policy debates, just two people getting to know each other outside of work. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me out, Dr. Dawson? She grinned. Maybe I am. Or maybe I just want to see if you're as good at conversation as you are at running billion-dollar companies. He laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. All right, he said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. Dinner it is. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt like he wasn't just fixing the past, he was stepping into a future worth looking forward to. The scent of roasted turkey and fresh-baked pie filled the penthouse as Lina Carter set the table, carefully placing each plate just as Mrs. Sullivan had shown her. The dining room, which once felt cold and formal, was now warm with the soft glow of candlelight. Thanksgiving had never been a grand affair in her life before, just her and her mom, sharing a small meal in their tiny apartment, laughing over burnt stuffing or store-bought pumpkin pie. But this year was different. This year, she had a family. Across the room, Alexander Reynolds stood by the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, carving the turkey with more focus than necessary. Lina smirked as she watched him. He had spent the past 3 hours following Mrs. Sullivan's instructions to the letter, determined to cook at least one dish without completely ruining it. "You know," Olivia Dawson teased as she leaned against the counter beside him, "for a man who can negotiate billion-dollar deals, you look strangely nervous about cutting a turkey." Alexander shot her a dry look. "I don't like to fail." Mrs. Sullivan chuckled as she stirred the gravy. "You're doing just fine, dear. Besides, if all else fails, we have plenty of side dishes to keep us from starving." Lina grinned and turned back to the table, adjusting the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one Alexander had given her on the anniversary of their first meeting. It was engraved with the same Celtic knot design from his tattoo, the same one her mother had worn. A symbol of eternal bonds. A year ago, she had been scared. She had lost her mother, had nowhere to go, and had walked into a world so different from the one she knew. But somehow, in all the uncertainty, she had found this, a home, a family, and a father who had once been a stranger but now felt like the safest place in the world. Alexander cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Lina, would you like to do the honors?" He nodded toward the Thanksgiving toast, something he had insisted they do properly. Lina blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "You." She hesitated, then glanced at Olivia, who smiled encouragingly. Mrs. Sullivan gave her a small nod, and Alexander simply waited, patient as ever. Taking a deep breath, Lina stood a little taller. "Well," she began, glancing around the table, "I guess I just want to say, thank you." Her fingers brushed over her bracelet. "A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything. But somehow, I ended up here, with all of you." She swallowed, forcing back the lump in her throat. "And I think my mom would be really happy about that." Silence settled over the room, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that held meaning. Alexander reached over, squeezing her hand gently. "She would be." Olivia raised her glass, her voice warm. "To family, new and old, found and unexpected." They all lifted their glasses. As Lina took a sip of her sparkling cider, she glanced around the table and realized something. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was home. The story of Lina and Alexander carries profound messages about family, redemption, and the power of second chances, themes that resonate deeply, especially for those who have experienced the complexities of life, love, and loss. It reminds us that relationships, no matter how fractured or distant, can be mended with effort, honesty, and an open heart. Alexander's transformation teaches us that success and financial security mean little if they come at the cost of meaningful human connections. His decision to embrace fatherhood, despite the challenges, underscores the idea that it's never too late to change, to do the right thing, and to prioritize what truly matters. For older audiences, this story offers a gentle but powerful reminder: the past cannot be rewritten, but the future is still ours to shape. We often carry regrets, missed opportunities, unspoken words, relationships that faded over time. But just like Alexander, we can choose to reach out, to reconnect, and to make amends. Lina's resilience shows us that love and belonging can be found in unexpected places if we remain open to them. Ultimately, the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't money, status, or accomplishments. It's the love and wisdom we pass on, the people we nurture, and the bonds we choose to strengthen. Because in the end, it is family, love, and human connection that truly give life its meaning.